My name is Brian Rothenberg with Progress, Ohio. We're here today because at the 11th hour last evening, Secretary Husted once again opted to play politics instead of protect the voters' right to vote. In a directive that I'll let Senator Turner and others and Subodh Chandra, our attorney, talk about, the Secretary of State has created a form where normally if you sign your information and put down your ID information, it is on the burden of the elections worker to ask for that information. They have made that burden a burden on the voter to actually fill out that information. And then at the 11th hour last night, he issued a directive that will essentially say those ballots get thrown out. Those provisional ballots will not be counted. By doing this, not only has he taken the duty of the voter to a new level that they're not used to, that they have to provide this information, but our Secretary of State has created a situation here in Ohio where he will invalidate thousands and thousands of people's votes, not even counting them as provisionals. They will not be counted at all. This is trickery. It is bad timing for someone to do this. This is not the way a Secretary of State should behave above the partisan fray. And at this point in time, I'm going to first introduce Senator Turner, and then Subodh Chandra, our attorney, and then we've got others that will address this issue. But this is a very important issue for Ohioans to understand. You now have the burden of making sure you fill out all this information. If you do not fill out this information, you will be disenfranchised by this game of trickery by Ohio's Secretary of State. And it is unconscionable when he knows how close Ohio is and what the stakes are. So with that, Senator Turner.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I want to thank Progress Ohio and all of my colleague Nikki and Representative Nikki Antonio is here and everybody else, all of the activists who are here. You know, Brian Rothenberg has laid it out and Subodh Chandra is going to lay it out further, but I just want to reiterate that this is the same Secretary of State who in a very uniform way took away early voting in urban areas and then uniformly took away early voting in all 88 counties. We have less voting opportunities in 2012 than we did in 2008. This is the same Secretary of State who appealed all the way to the United States Supreme Court to take away the last 3 days of early voting from all Ohioans, including veterans. So I am not surprised today that in the 11th hour he would do something else that is just as deplorable in terms of trying to suppress the vote in the state of Ohio. You know, Secretary of State in Ohio used to, SOS used to stand for Secretary of State, but under the leadership of John Husted, SOS stands for Secretary of Suppression. And that is exactly what he is doing in his office. But we want to encourage every single voter in the state of Ohio to make sure that if they do have to fill that out, that they fill it all the way out up into the signature line, because just because a lawsuit has been filed, we still have 4 days left, and we want to make sure that we decrease the likelihood that a provisional ballot would be thrown out. But make no mistake about it, this is the Republicans' way of trying to rig this election, and it's just as egregious as what some of my foremothers and forefathers had to go through in the 50s and the 60s. It might not be a poll tax, it might not be a literacy test, it might not be the grandfather clause, but it is just as egregious to try to suppress the vote of working class people, of African Americans, Hispanic women, and young people. This is the same Secretary of State. So we should not be surprised of what he's doing in the state of Ohio. Everybody knows that Ohio is the last line of defense for President Barack Obama, and they're doing everything they can to stop people. But even more important to that, than that, we should let people vote. And it doesn't matter whether they're Republican, Democrat, or Independent, they should have the right to vote. This has a class component to it as well. Stop all the partisan games and let the citizens of this state vote. We're going to turn it over now to our attorney.
This is Brian Davis, and it was his court case from his organization that this issue deals with.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and what I'm going to do is explain to you what the issue is, and I think it'll be very understandable me is, let's wait till that passes there. With me is Brian Davis, a community organizer with the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless. And then also we have representatives from SEIU Local 1199, which is also a co-plaintiff in the case along with the Homeless Coalition in the Southern District of Ohio in front of Judge Marbley. Now here's the issue. Provisional ballots tend to be handed to people who are poorer and tend to vote more progressively. That is a fact. Why? Because provisional ballots... That was nice touch with the Romney-Ryan bus there. Is that really? They were trying to drown out the 47%. The issue here is that provisional ballots tend to be handed to folks who don't have a form of identification that costs money, like a state driver's license or a state-issued ID, or a bank statement in your name, a utility statement in your name. So the provisional ballots tend to be handed to those people who, thanks to SEIU Local 1199 and the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless, have the right to vote with the last 4 digits of their social security number. Okay? If it was not for these groups and their successful litigation in the federal court order, they would not be able to vote on election day because of Secretary Husted's voter ID statute, which he was the Speaker of the House when that passed in 2006. So that's the background. Now here's what he has done, and it is a very, very clever and indeed underhanded maneuver. What was done here is that Ohio law expressly requires only 2 things from voters when they're filling out a provisional ballot affirmation form. What is your name? And sign and affirm that you're an eligible voter. That is all that Ohio law requires. I'm going to, for those that want to verify this, it is Ohio Revised Code Section 3505.181B6. B like boy, 6. That's all a voter is required to do. Then, in subsection B7 of that same statute, it is the election worker that is unambiguously required to record the information as to the type of ID that that voter used and to indicate whether that voter is supposed to come back with additional information to the board. We call that due process. You're told if there's a problem and you need to come back. That is what Ohio law requires, expressly, unambiguously. And indeed, in federal court in the last couple of weeks, the Secretary of State's lawyer said this on the record, and we have the transcript, said it is the poll worker's job to record that ID information. But here's what the Secretary did. He issued a provisional ballot affirmation form that is inconsistent with the Ohio statute, or the form statutory form, which is at that same subsection 3505.182. That's got the statute laying out what the form is supposed to look like. Here's what the Secretary's form looks like. He shifts the obligation to record the ID information back to the voter. He shifts it back to the voter, and there's no indication about whether the voter is told that they have to come back with more information. That's step 2 of his form now. He's got the name and the signature, which is fine, but then he shifts in step 2 of Form 12B the obligation to the voter. Now, why is this important? Because last night, at the 11th hour, he issued a directive that ordered boards of elections to disenfranchise provisional ballot voters who have any sort... Let me start again. Last night at the 11th hour, the Secretary of State issued a directive that would order boards of elections to disenfranchise provisional ballot voters who have any error whatsoever on this form, which would include the portion that where he shifted the poll worker's responsibility to the voter. Now you may say, why is that so important? Here's why it's so important. You're talking about poorer and sometimes more transient voters who are filling out this form. Okay, so there's a higher statistical likelihood that they're not going to be voting for the Secretary's preferred political party. Now, those folks then are going to have a higher statistical likelihood, the more burden is shifted to them, that there could be an error. Is this phenomenon real? Absolutely. In 2008, there were 14,000 deficient ballot affirmation forms that were disenfranchised. That's 14,000. And so in this election, the more of a statistical likelihood that the Secretary can create of an error on the form, the more provisional ballots will be disenfranchised. So what we have done on behalf of the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless and SEIU Local 1199 is we have asked Judge Marbley to clarify his order to be consistent with what the Secretary of State said in open court to begin with, which is that these ballots will be counted, okay, even if there's an error on that step 2. Okay, if there's an error on step 1 or step 3, the name or the signature, the court at this point has decided that that's fine. But this issue of step 2, the Secretary is violating Ohio law on it, and that's the position that we've taken with the court. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, how many provisional ballots were cast in 2008?
I'm sorry I don't have that figure at the tip of my tongue, but it was quite a few. And one of the things that you should know is that over time, what research by, for example, Rutgers University did a study is the more likely it is that somebody gets pushed into the provisional ballot column, the higher percentage chance that their vote gets discarded. And so it's been up to 25% of provisional ballots can be discarded and disenfranchised.
And what statistics do you have on who cast provisional ballots? How much do you know about it?
Well, what we do know is that the consent decree covers those people who tend to be poorer, who are voting not with a driver's license, but with the last 4 digits of their social security number to prove their identity. And so that tends to be a high degree of the number of provisional ballots that are counted. Sometimes it's people who are confused about what location they should be in as well, which is another position that State Senator Nina Turner is aware that the Secretary also took in the same litigation the indefensible position that when a government worker blunders and misdirects you, either intentionally or unintentionally, to the wrong precinct at your polling location. We have, in urban areas, we have multiple precincts, single polling locations. And the Secretary of State took the position that when a government worker blunders and misdirects you to the wrong precinct, that you should lose your civil liberty and you should lose your vote. Now that is hardly a conservative position to say that big government should be able to disenfranchise you when big government has misdirected you to the wrong place.
One last thing is,
and by the way, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals shut him down on that and said, no way, we're not going to permit that.
What is the status of what provisional ballots are going to count and what aren't going to count according to the latest court rulings?
Well, what the current picture is it's up in the air as to whether or not a mistake on step 2 will or will not count. And that's why our message to voters, because the voters can't control these suppression efforts by the Secretary of State. What the voters, we are trying to alert them to is that they should be vigilant and they should make every endeavor, even though Ohio law doesn't require them to fill out step 2, they should make every effort to fill it out completely because they can't be guaranteed at this point that courts will permit their vote to count.
And there were about 207 provisional ballots cast in 2000.
207,000.
Oh, excuse me, 207,000.
In Ohio.
In Ohio.
14,000 weren't counted. 14,000 weren't counted.
No, 14,000 were not counted, I believe, on the basis of a deficient affirmation.
Right, there were 40,000 of those 207,000 that had errors that were disqualified for some reason. So this just further exacerbates this. And just to really kind of paint this picture, this is on top of all the other stuff, this environment of voter suppression, from billboards to, cutting early voting hours. I mean, voters are more confused in 2012 than they have been at any other time. So this is big, and to add this at the last minute.
And let's take the example of early. Let's take the example of early voting. There are many public officials who say, "Well, we should run government more like a business." Could anybody name for me any business that would still be in business if at the day of peak demand they said we're not going to be open? So, I mean, as we all know, Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, is the most popular day to go shopping. What if every business said, "Well, too many people want to shop that day, so we're going to close"? That was essentially the position that the Secretary of State took with respect to early voting.
And so your group's just trying to get the judge to clarify and send something to Husted, basically saying, as long as step 1 and step 3 are valid, the provisional ballot
should be counted, as
and
opposed to
are you expecting that to happen before Tuesday?
What the judge has done is he has set a briefing schedule, because remember that provisional ballots don't actually get counted under Ohio law until several days after the election. So November 6th is when the Secretary's brief in response to our motion to clarify is due, and we file a reply 2 days later.
We won't know until election.
Which is why it's so important that voters understand that they need to fill it all out, and that's hopefully what we want.
Even though the Secretary admitted that they're not required to do so.
The remedy of the two things, but as the non-lawyer and non-legislator, the remedy of this is people just need to fill this form out and be vigilant. The second thing take away from this is federal courts have repeatedly in Ohio decided on making a voter's vote count. The Secretary of State, unfortunately, this Secretary of State, has repeatedly sided on trying to play games and making it harder and putting barriers in front of the voter's vote count.
Did he say anything in the directive as to why?
He did not, and the fact that he waited until this hour to do this when he knows...
No, and in fact, let me back up, Ryan, because this is important for folks to realize, and I'm happy to share a copy of the letter with you. 2 days before he issued the directive, I think it was the morning of, it was Wednesday morning, I sent an email to the Secretary of State's counsel saying, we know you have a forthcoming directive coming to implement Judge Marbley's other orders where he's corrected your actions. In issuing that directive, please act consistently with what you told the court and clarify that any deficiency with regard to step 2 of your erroneous form will not be held against voters, and they are not to disenfranchise voters. Please respond by noon tomorrow. We received no response. I then made a follow-up phone call in the afternoon. No response. They didn't send us the directive to share it with us. They just put it on their website at the end of the day yesterday after courts were closed. And that is a serious problem. It shows this sort of willful effort to try to make these rules that disenfranchise voters without even engaging in a dialogue about the mistake on his form.
Just real quick, Representative, did you want to say something?
The only thing I want to say, to reiterate what everyone else has said, is that it's so important that we get the message out to the voters, and the voters need to take the time, however long it takes, to fill those forms out completely. I think the other message is that there are some of us standing here and who have their back and are supportive of their right to vote. We want all people to be able to vote, and so that's the most important
Regardless
thing.
of how they're...
That's right. Exactly. It's that right to vote.
That matters.
And I think it's really important that in spite of this issue, we don't want people to think that their vote will not count. So we want to make sure that they know that their vote counts. We're going to work on making sure it counts 2 days, 3 days, and 5 days after, if that's what it takes.
And we'll be around if you have questions, but I know Kim wants to get heat. I'm watching you shiver.
Days. Yeah, sorry. I didn't mean
We need to get you gloves.
I know.
Do you need names or spellings?
No. Turner. Yeah, do you have you heard anything else about voter suppression? I've been reading about phone calls going out locally from Zimmerman, possibly, in this area. Calling people saying they're not registered to vote. Do you guys have any sources?
Thanks, Tammy. No, we don't have any sources. Somebody even told me today they saw something up in the air saying early vote is 1 to 7 or something like that.
Yeah, there's been a plane flying around that just says the wrong time for early voting, and it says that the polls are open till 8 o'clock at night. It's a plane flying by with a banner.
And that
We
was
don't
out
know
here.
what the source is, but it's been flying. I got a couple of folks who noticed it flying around the neighborhoods.
Excuse me, what did it say?
It just gives the wrong times for early voting, and it says that the polls are open till 8 o'clock at night, and they're not.
Thank you.
This case where this directive is sort of coming in office? Is it
Those provisional votes are
decision
being
not to count
which will disenfranchise thousands of people
provisional ballots that are cast outside of someone's polling station?
There was a court case.
I'm having trouble keeping all these. Yeah.
We're here today with the lawyer.
There's been no formal order from the Sixth
Who
Circuit
will be
saying that wrong location ballots are not to be counted. However,
There isn't.
the Sixth
there wasn't
Circuit,
an official-
what the Sixth Circuit did was grant a stay of the judge's order that said they should be counted, saying that we were unlikely to succeed on that issue. Now, we very strongly disagree with the court because the court ignored evidence in the record. And remember, that was not as the court characterized it. The court characterized it as, oh, well, and the secretary said, well, then people just show up wherever they want, it'll be chaos.
The concern here is the secretary-
But that was not what the order said. What the order said was that where there is evidence that the poll worker has misled someone to going to the wrong location, and we had evidence of that in the record. There were example after example, and many poll workers after the fact freely admitted that they had made a mistake. It wasn't necessarily intentional. Although you can see with a rule like this now, it could lead to chicanery, where some poll workers decide to
prolong the law to saying that poll workers prohibited.
You are amazing.
which was never went into effect.
Right, correct.
And which, of course, you know, raises the question: what are they there for then? Are they potted plants? So right now, it does appear that the Sixth Circuit is going to be ruling in that direction. That fight isn't over yet, it still won't be over, even if they rule that way, because we will still have the opportunity. This is at the very preliminary injunction stage. We'll still have the opportunity to present evidence of affirmative poll worker error, and it happens inevitably, even if it isn't deliberate. These government workers make mistakes in the heat of the situation, and then they misdirect people to the wrong polling location. We're not saying that that vote should count for races for which that voter wasn't eligible. You know, like a city council race or a state rep race were in the wrong precinct. We're saying that it should be remade to count the things for which they were eligible. And at the end of the day, what's wrong with that? I mean, why would this secretary take the position that people should be affirmatively disenfranchised when it's simply a bureaucratic error by the government? That just doesn't even make any logical sense. Sure, it's Subodh Chandra, S-U-B-O-D-H-C-H-A-N-D-R-A, and I'm outside counsel to the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless and SEIU Local 1199.
I'll call your office on Monday and see if you guys hear anything. I'm very interested in any voter suppression stuff around the area.
Okay, yeah, and I'll be at as many polling places as I can over this whole week. So call me.
Well, I have your Adam.
Thank you. Okay.
I'll bug you.
Okay, you bug Adam. Okay.
I'll bug you.
Sure. Let me take one also.
Slow down.